Welcome, everyone, to this 76th episode of the Clements Bookworm. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library, and your host this morning, and I'm so happy that you're here with us. Just a couple of items so that you can participate fully if you haven't joined us before. We do use the chat function, and it is available to audience members as well. So please go ahead and chime in and change the setting to everyone so that all of the participants can see your comments. However, if you have a question, please remember to put that in the Q&A section, and you can ask your questions there, but you can also upvote, and that is give a thumbs up to questions that someone else has asked that you might also have. That way, if there's a large queue of questions, they sort of get put in an order for us. As part of our as part of us making this as accessible as possible to everyone, we do indeed have the machine captioning turned on today. So you can toggle that on or off, and you can change the size. So play around with that so it works for you in the way that you would like it. And side-by-side mode should also be available, which will allow you to change the relative size of the slides and the speakers. So move that around a little bit because I can only control so much of what you see. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of the history and culture of North America and the Caribbean up into the early 1900s. So I would also like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. And today we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library also acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and the established hierarchies of settler colonialism. All right. If you have not had a chance to click on the poll question, do that very fast, and I will end the poll and share the results. Okay, so what we asked is, what is the oldest work collected by any Black bibliophile? And the answer is from 1550, and Laura's going to paste a little more into the chat about that answer so that if you're interested, you can take a look at that. And of course, we'll be talking more about this in today's program. And now I would like to introduce today's guests who are joining us as part of the Clements Library's celebration of Black History Month. U of M has chosen as this year's theme, "It Starts With Us, Embracing Our Collective Power," as a reminder and celebration of the legacy of brilliant Black achievement and resolute activism in pursuit of a better tomorrow. Laura Helton is a historian who writes about collections and how they shape our world. She is Associate Professor of English and History at the University of Delaware, where she teaches African American literature, book history, archival studies, and public humanities. Her first book, Scattered in Fugitive Things, How Black Collectors Created Archives and Remade History, was published by Columbia University Press in April 2024. and has won the Arlene Custer Memorial Book Prize from the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference. She is a scholar editor of Remaking the World of Arturo Schomburg, a collaborative digital project with Fisk University and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. She is joined today in conversation by Jason R. Young, who is Associate Professor of History, Director, Institute for the Humanities, and Mary Fair Krauscher Professor of the Humanities at the University of Michigan. He teaches and researches in the fields of 19th century United States history, African American history, and the African diaspora. He specializes in the history of art, religion, and folk culture. And Jason is a previous presenter on the Bookworm. All right. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Really looking forward to it.
Shall I go ahead and share my screen now?
You shall indeed, and I'll leave you to it.
Great. Does that look good to everyone?
It does. It looks good.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, good morning, everyone. I want to start out by thanking the Clements Library for hosting this talk, and to Dr. Jason Young for joining me in conversation. I'm really excited for our conversation and for the questions that you all have. And I also want to say I'm really excited to be part of a series that's called The Bookworm, because I write about bookworms. And so I'm going to really take that title literally today. We're going to really dig into the world of folks who thought of themselves as bookworms. The first slide that you see here is the color original image of what was depicted on the cover of Scattered and Fugitive Things. And it's so beautiful in its color form that I wanted to share that with you. It's called The Librarian. It first appeared in a very famous anthology that was published in 1925 called The New Negro, which was edited by Elaine Locke. And the original of this series by the artist Reese are held at Fisk University in their galleries, and I thank Fisk for the permission to share in presentations this original. I think it's an incredibly beautiful image. So I want to give you a bit of a backstory about how I came to write this book. I started my career as an archivist of American social movements, and what I learned in those years working as an archivist has shaped all of the research that I've done since then. For example, I worked at the Tamiment Library at New York University, which documents the history of American radicalism and trade union movements. And I learned at the Tamiment Library that every social movement has its resident documentarians, the people who are taking the minutes, who are taking photographs, keeping the ephemera. That's how we have a record of grassroots movements, is because of those activist archivists who are part of the movement. When I was working at the Tamiment Library with these movement archives, records often came to us with a chaotic provenance brought into the library by a dozen different activists stuffed into shopping bags or boxes that were brimming with leaflets and flyers from rallies and protests. They were kind of chaotic and not particularly organized. And I learned through that there's always a tension between order and disorder in any archival collection. There's the disorder of those records as they came to us, which reflected the decentralized movement culture of organizations, of grassroots organizations. And that was often in tension with the order that we as archivists had to impose on the material to make it usable. Early in my career, I also worked as a field archivist in Mississippi, and I was processing collections of the civil rights movement. I worked across the state and I moved between different institutions. I worked sometimes at the libraries of HBCUs like Tougaloo College. One of their documents is featured here. And Tougaloo had incubated the civil rights movement. It had nurtured the movement. And the archive there was started as a civil rights archive. But I also was working with collections at formerly segregated white institutions like the Mississippi Department of Archives and History that housed the records of those who had fought and surveilled the civil rights movement. Historians have to study both kinds of records to understand the history of the movement. But moving between those different kinds of institutions, I learned that archives are living and contested sites of memory in the present. I learned how histories of racial exclusion in archives and libraries continue to mark the contemporary landscape of information and memory. So I had those lessons in mind as I was at the very beginning of this book. And I had those lessons in mind when I came across a document that in many ways launched the idea for Scattered and Fugitive Things. So in the papers of the poet Sterling Brown, which were then held at Howard University in Washington, D.C., I came across a form letter, so a kind of a letter that someone had written and sent to many different people. And it was written by the poet Claude McKay in 1937. And it begins with the salutation, "Dear friend and confrère." And in the letter, McKay is proposing to form a new, what he called Democratic Association of Negro Writers. So he wanted to create a writers group. And he imagined it as a group that would honor the writers of the past while also fostering the ambitions of a new generation of up-and-coming writers. And what's interesting about the letter is that as McKay is trying to describe his idea, he's trying to find the right words to describe this imagined collective that he wants to form, his mind wanders to an archive, and specifically to the archive created by his longtime friend and sometimes frenemy, Arturo or Arthur Schomburg, who's pictured here. Schomburg was a self-taught Black intellectual who was born in Puerto Rico in 1874, and he migrated to New York City in 1891. By 1937, when McKay writes this letter, Schomburg had spent 4 decades amassing a collection from all parts of the world, documenting the history and culture of the African diaspora. That collection had taken shape first in his various apartments and then the parlor of this row house that's pictured in the middle here, but it eventually outgrew his family's row house. And in 1926, it was acquired by the New York Public Library and deposited at the Harlem branch, the 135th Street branch library. And so it was really at the center of the Harlem scene. And like many writers of what was called the New Negro movement, McKay had relied on Schomburg's collection. He would borrow books from Schomburg or ask Schomburg to look things up for him. He frequented the library on 135th Street. But in this letter, McKay is talking about Schomburg's collection not as a physical place with reference materials, but as an idea, as a concept of collectivity. And so he says in the letter, "We think that it is possible to establish through intellectual fellowship something like a living counterpart of the unparalleled Schomburg collection of Negro books in the domain of scholarship." Now that line stuck with me, and it has stayed with me ever since, because on some level, it's a little strange. What does it mean for McKay to propose that a gathering of people could be something like a group of books and papers? The surprising premise that appears in McKay's letter evokes for me the unexpected ways that paper collections can serve as vital sites of intellectual and social life, right? So this is McKay drawing on the idea of an archive to propose an idea of people coming together in collectivity. So an archive here is not simply a storehouse of the past, right? It's a site of intellectual and social life in the present. And I knew when I came across this letter that it hinted at a story that had not been fully told. And that's a story that takes place about a century ago in the years between 1910 and 1950, when a remarkable set of library and archival collections for the study of Black life and history emerged. It was a period when generations of more informal kinds of Black memory work coalesced into a frenetic moment of institution building. So from the great libraries of the North to small repositories in the South and across the campuses of Black colleges and universities, Schomburg and other bibliophiles, scrapbook makers, and librarians of this period salvaged records, they opened their collections to readers, and they cast preservation as a political act. The institutions that they created have supported over a century of inquiry. In fact, it would be impossible to imagine the field of Black studies today without these collections. And I hope that Dr. Young and I will talk a bit about what these collections continue to mean to scholars who study Black life and history. But what McKay's letter suggests is that as important as that scholarly legacy is, these collections and archives didn't come into being simply to bequeath to future historians a set of sources. These collections were alive in the present at the moment of their making. They were a site of cultural experimentation, intellectual risk, and political possibility. What did these archives mean to the generations that built them? And what can we learn from that history? Those are the questions that Scattered and Fugitive Things tries to take up. So just to give you an overview of the book, it begins in Harlem in the 1910s and 1920s, in the parlors of bookmen like the bibliophile Arturo Schomburg and the scrapbook maker Alexander Gumby, who's pictured in the lower photograph. These opening chapters ask, how did collectors imagine Black archives? What should be kept and why? The book then follows a gendered shift in the keeping of Black records in the 1920s and 1930s as collections began to move out of these parlors and into the reading rooms of public libraries and HBCU libraries, where they were curated by professional women like Virginia Lee in Roanoke, Virginia, who's pictured at the top here, and Dorothy Porter at Howard University, who's pictured on the bottom. These middle chapters are about the risks that collectors took to make these archives accessible. And the book culminates with the question of how archiving is embedded in Black public life and in activism, focusing on the work in the 1940s of the librarian Vivian Harsh in Chicago, who's pictured with her staff here at the top, and L.D. Reddick, the historian in New York. And this bottom photo is a picture of a picket or a protest that was happening outside the New York Public Library in 1948 to protest the resignation of Reddick from his position at the Schomburg collection. Scattered and Fugitive Things builds on a groundbreaking symposium that was held in 1983 at Howard University at the Moreland Spingarn Research Center. And the symposium was called Black Bibliophiles and Collectors, a national symposium that was organized by Eleanor Sinnett and W. Paul Coates, who were both members of the Moreland Spingarn staff. And they co-edited with the curator Thomas Battle this volume of essays that's pictured here. And this was the first to survey the field of Black collections, special collections and archives. And in their introduction, Sinnett, Coates, and Battle call their work just a beginning. And they say that this is an effort that needs to be reflected upon and absorbed and vigorously pursued anew. In the 40 years since they issued that call, there has been a swell of attention to archives beyond just the work professional archivists think about and theorize archives all the time, right? But in more recent decades, scholars outside of the field of professional archives have also paid more attention to the question of archives. And for scholars in Black studies, the archival turn, as we call it, has opened up ways to talk about how African diasporic people have by necessity made archives that dwell in unwritten or imaginative form. So the ways that you have to look for Black history in non-traditional kinds of archives. Now, all archives hold what the theorist Vern Harris has called a sliver of a sliver of a sliver of the human record. But for the African diaspora, that sliver has often become just a shadow, with archives and histories lost to the Middle Passage, ruptured by the forced separations of families, and made to go underground by legal prohibitions on Black literacy. The weight of those cumulative erasures over time has fueled in the field of Black studies a very powerful body of contemporary writing that grapples with how to study Black history in light of all that will never be recovered, as Saidiya Hartman writes. And collectors could never fill these enormous gaps, no matter how much they collected. But at the same time, they also engaged deeply with what the historian Anjali Arendecker calls the archival poetics of ordinary surplus. And so in Scattered and Fugitive Things, I argue that in addition to the language of archival silences and absence, which is very important language, we also need to expand our lexicon for talking about Black archives, especially to make sense of the profusion of collecting work among Black thinkers of the early 20th century. Because the intellectual work that they were doing was really about surplus and abundance, right? Rather than just about absence. So to think about that kind of abundance, I turn to sources that often hide in plain sight, or what the historian Antoinette Burton has called the backstage of archives. So the collectors that I write about in Scattered and Fugitive Things didn't write treatises or memoirs about their work. Most of their writing took shape in genres that often escape notice as writing at all, like discard catalog, right? Or a list of reading materials, a bibliography, a classification scheme. And several of the women that I write about, especially the two who served as public librarians, Vivian Harsh and Virginia Lee, left behind almost no correspondence for historians to read and study. But their work is not absent from the archive. I would say instead, following Kathy Pice's argument about the records of librarianship, that it is abundant and unrecognized. So we have to find ways to recognize it. These are mimeographed lists, files of newspaper clippings, headings in a card file, all once essential conduits to knowledge that many of us remember using, right, in our own research. But they've receded from everyday use now, and they've been largely ignored until recently as sources that we can use for writing intellectual history. And that's partly because they're bureaucratic in tone and they're covert in their political viewpoint. And so they seem to reveal little about the risks or the radicality of the work that was undertaken by the people who made these tools. But in the book, I try to recapture the urgency of these cast-off sources. And one of the things that comes into focus when we start paying attention to the backstage of archives and libraries, to these kinds of sources, is the ubiquity of Black intellectual engagements with collecting and collections and with the work of cataloging and classification. We might think of this as a tradition that spans from W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a prolific bibliographer, to Audre Lorde, who was not just a poet, but began her career as a librarian. And so across this tradition, a striking number of writers who are famous for their poetry or their prose also engaged in significant but often not well-known ways with the less heralded work of collecting, cataloging, and classification. So I won't exhaustively list all of the examples here, because if I did, we'd be here all day. The writers Nella Larson, Anne Spencer, and Arne Bontemps were all librarians. Elaine Locke wrote a study guide for the American Library Association. The modernist poet Robert Hayden inventoried manuscripts. Mary Church Terrell and James Weldon Johnson both helped launch new archives. And the list could go on and on. Black writers exercised a deep and enduring commitment to creating the kinds of files, archives, lists, and places for study that should have existed for them, but did not. The fact that the work of prominent men like Du Bois becomes a footnote to their career at precisely the moment that their work most resembles that of librarians is really about the gendered slant of intellectual history, right? It's about what kinds of work we consider to be intellectually important and what kinds of work we overlook. The field of intellectual history has paid too little attention to the figures who were very often women who built the 20th century's information infrastructures. Now, broadly speaking, the gendered framework of intellectual history that I'm talking about entails not simply erasing women thinkers, Rather, it's a kind of eclipse of certain types of labor, like librarianship or scrapbooking, that are associated with women's domestic work, even if they're performed by men and women alike. So in Scattered and Fugitive Things, I want to center figures who turned these underappreciated modes of intellectual labor into radical experiments in Black cultural production. Now, it's important to step back and think about the historical moment that this collecting work is happening. These collections took shape at a moment when, as Schomburg said, there was no national interest in quote unquote Negro books. Right? This is a moment when scholarly and popular accounts and print culture cast doubt on the very idea of Black history. And it's a moment when the very act of reading could require the exercise of fugitivity. So Schomburg, for example, grew up in Puerto Rico under Spanish colonial rule at a time when it was considered seditious to read the works of his favorite revolutionary poet, Rafael Serra. So he remembered reading Serra's work in what he called Under Darkness when he was a boy in the late 1880s. Schomburg then migrated to the United States in the 1890s. And when he came of age, it was the moment when, in the United States, the first state archives were emerging in southern state capitals, specifically to enshrine Confederate memory. That was the memory landscape in the US. And as an adult, Schomburg honed his collecting habit in the early 20th century at a time when the US policed its color line so fiercely that somewhere between 8 to 11 million African-American readers could not go into their hometown libraries because of segregation. These forms of suppression, Schomburg said in his most famous essay, which is called The Negro Digs Up His Past, Schomburg says that these forms of suppression gave rise to a collecting imperative that was forged by empire and exclusion. So Schomburg says, we find the Negro compelled out of the very pressure of the present to become the most enthusiastic antiquarian of them all, right? So in other words, it's the pressures and the oppressions of the present that push him and others to turn to history. And with each acquisition that he made, including a copy of the once banned Serra that he had read furtively in his youth, that became a prized possession in his library, Schomburg rebuked the prohibitions on Black knowledge that he had grown up with. So against the pressure of negation, he and his generation of collectors defiantly created archives. It was defiant, but it was also exuberant. And I want to underscore this because if Black archiving in the New Negro era was a form of protest, and it certainly was, it was also a site of invention and pleasure. So there's a line that was written about Schomburg in 1922 in the newspaper, The Negro World, that I think points to this. And it says, Schomburg has a penchant for books, rare books, and if he should suddenly die with his overcoat on, it will be found that the pockets will contain catalogs from London, Leipzig, Italy, England, and the USA, all marked up by this old bookworm at the places where there's any reference to the African or Negro. And this vignette, I think, captures both the zeal of Schomburg's penchant, right, his penchant for rare books, but also the community's esteem for his obsessive venture. From cabinets that were stuffed with ephemera to library stacks crowded with books, Schomburg and other Black collectors created abundance where others saw absence. And there was a joy to that work. By the 1930s, their collecting pursuits had produced a stunning plenitude of texts, and collections became vibrant spaces of intellectual life, where Black thinkers came together to form study groups and invent taxonomies and reshape racial imaginaries. The scale and the scope of their work sparked heterogeneous experiments in ordering Black knowledge. And cutting across this heterogeneity, I argue, are three principles, what we might think of as principles of Black archiving. And those are the principles of value, order, and risk. So I'll start with value. Bibliophiles and collectors of the early 20th century had to invent the very idea of a Black archive. They had to see abundance where others had seen absence. And they had to see value where others had seen something that was refuse or trash, right? So their work challenged the devaluation of the Black past and present. And these collectors also put into practice a second principle, which is the principle of order, and I would say when necessary, disordering Black knowledge. They had to dislodge Blackness from information structures that treated it as a problem, and instead plumb all of its possibilities. And you see this principle in action, for example, in the way that Dorothy Porter at Howard sort of took apart the Dewey Decimal Classification and then put it back together in a way that was more capacious and attentive to the richness of Black history. And you see it in the way that I'll talk about in a little bit, the way that the scrapbook maker Alexander Gumby experimented with how to arrange and categorize his ephemera. And finally, these first two principles underline a third principle, which is to take risks, at once material and intellectual, to provide access to Black ideas. These bibliophiles and collectors had to challenge laws of segregation and sedition in order to protect the right for their collections to exist. They embraced a radical politics of access to make their materials available to the readers and thinkers who needed them. And that work sometimes hinged upon acts of fugitivity or defiance, as we will see. So through the exercise of these three principles, the makers of this founding set of Black archives left behind not only an abundance of paper, but also a model of intellectual practice. And that model is one that refused to see Black history constrained or threatened, and out of that refusal made something new. So that's an overview of the book. And what I thought I might do now is kind of take you inside three scenes from the book, each of which will elaborate on one of those principles that I just named. And these are three scenes from one from each of the first three chapters in the book. So scene one comes from chapter 1, and it's really about that question of value. It's about navigating the market. And this will bring us back to Schomburg. So in 1916, Schomburg wrote a letter to Elaine Locke about an upcoming auction of rare books, and it had been advertised as an auction of a splendid collection of publications on slavery that had come from the library of the late Joseph Bryan. And Schomburg had an eye on one item in particular, and it was a copy of a 1680 book by Morgan Godwin called The Negroes and Indians Advocate. And so in his letter to Locke, Schomburg is kind of rambling a bit about this auction upcoming and what he's hoping to get. And he's kind of thinking through the price of Black history. So I'm going to read a kind of a longish excerpt from this letter and then talk about it. So he says, Saturday, I visited the Andersons galleries and had a view of the rarities. By the way, who is this Bryan to have gathered so interesting a lot of Negroes' books in Richmond, Virginia? I have a few bids on the rare items, but I'm afraid the collectors are up in arms. Now is the time to buy anti-slavery items. The prices are cheap, dirt cheap. I paid 30 cents for 2 volumes that belonged to Phyllis Wheatley's collection, only inscribed September 24th, 1774. But my holograph letter of Toussaint Louverture I consider a very priceless desiderata. I'll keep you posted on the Bryan sale. I have a bid of $7 on the Godwin item, printed in 1680, one of the rarest and choicest Negro items in existence. Mr. Harper, a collector, has a perfect copy for which he charges the sum of $100, so that my chances for putting my hands on Godwin is very doubtful. So I want to walk us through this letter a bit, because in it, Schomburg moves between a lot of different emotions, right? So he's expressing at one moment regret for the prohibitive cost of some items, right? He's saying, I just don't think I'm going to be able to afford to buy this Morgan Godwin book, right? And then at other moments, he's expressing bafflement at how cheap the prices are, right? That anti-slavery items are cheap, right? That he paid 30 cents for 2 volumes that had belonged once to the great poet Phyllis Wheatley. He can't believe that what he sees as so valuable, other people see as having so little value, right? And then he has this idea that some objects, like his Toussaint Louverture letter, couldn't be measured by any price, right? They're priceless. Now, Schomburg was a shrewd buyer, and he knew to temper these emotions with stealth when he was operating in these auction houses. He would take advantage of the market's indifference when he could. Because he knew that if wealthier bidders got up in arms, as he says in this letter, meaning they get kind of excited about a particular item, he knew that by comparison to the rich white bibliophiles he was competing with, that he stood little chance at securing his desiderata. Schomburg was a clerk in the mailroom of a bank. He was he had a secure life, but he was rich. He was not rich by any stretch of the imagination. And Schomburg repeatedly lost bids on items he desperately wanted to buy, like the 18th century almanacs of Benjamin Banneker, which almost always Schomburg was outbid by this white millionaire from New York who was collecting early Americana. So in this letter, although Schomburg says he's willing to proffer $7 for Godwin, which is a decent sum of money, he feels that his chances of getting it are doubtful. Now, when Schomburg goes into the auction gallery on the day of the Bryan sale, he's really working at odds with a rare book market that did not account for Black collectors' theories of value. In the tools of the antiquarian book trade, and remember how I said we were going to really dive deep into the world of bookworms? Here we go. So in the antiquarian book trade, there are various tools that collectors would use to try to assess the going prices of books. And one of them was American book prices current. And so occasionally you could track the going prices of a Black authored text through this tool, like Wheatley's poems, right? So when the appetite of Schomburg's cohort of Black bibliophiles dovetailed with the mainstream rare book market, you would be able to kind of see what prices Black authored texts were going for. So a worn first edition of Wheatley sold for $3 in 1911, for example, while a copy that had been treated by a famous bookbinder sold for $35 in 1920. But the vast majority of works by Black authors traded below the threshold, which was $3, that would get you an entry in American book prices current. So in other words, American book prices current just didn't record anything that was sold for less than $3. And the vast majority of works by Black authors sold for less than that amount. So those who specialized in Black materials had to make their own assessments. They couldn't turn to a tool like American book prices current because it just didn't account for most of Black print culture. So you see this discussion in their letters. Like the Black bookstore owner, George Young, remarked that copies of Frederick Douglass's autobiographies were what he said worth their weight in gold, right? So to him, they have great value. But in the rare book market, Frederick Douglass's Life and Times doesn't garner a single entry in book prices current between 1900 and 1926. It's just off the radar of the mainstream book market. And his narrative, Frederick Douglass's narrative, appeared just one time, and it was sold for $4.50. So that underscores the discrepancy between the market's indifference to Black texts and, on the other hand, the way Black bibliophiles spoke of their treasures, right, as priceless, right, or worth their weight in gold. Now, despite his pessimism in the letter to Elaine Locke, Schomburg actually won the item that he coveted. He paid $5.25 for Godwin's The Negroes and Indians Advocate. In fact, he got 20 items from the sale. He said, pretty good for a novice. He said that to Locke. But it was the Godwin that he most admired, right? Just as Schomburg's youthful reading of the revolutionary poet Rafael Serra had defied Spanish restrictions on literacy, Schomburg's purchase of this item of the Godwin rebuked its previous ownership in rather remarkable fashion, although Schomburg may have been unaware of that. Because remember in the letter, he said, who is this Bryan to have gathered so interesting a lot of Negroes' books? So what was being sold was the library of someone named Joseph Bryan, and Schomburg didn't really know who that was. But if he had known, it might have left him, I don't know, either feeling triumphant or maybe unsettled, because Joseph Bryan was a founder of the Virginia Historical Society. He was descended from a family of enslavers, and he was a partisan of the idea of the lost cause. And he was someone who helped populate the South with Confederate monuments. And he was actively opposed to Black suffrage, or the right to vote. This is who had these materials that Schomburg bought. So Schomburg rejoiced in winning his bid on the Negroes and Indians Advocate, but he may not have fully apprehended the extent to which his acquisition of this item radically reframed it, right? Because Godwin's proto-abolitionist text moved from the bookshelves of a white supremacist bibliophile who saw slavery as beneficial, right, to the enslaved, and it moved into the collection of Schomburg, who had once described slavery's insurrectionists, Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner and John Brown, as his figures, as the heroes that he worshipped, right? So it really transforms the object from one collection to another. And so that gives you a sense of the way that as the market turned away from certain items, Black bibliophiles had a different sense of value for these items, and they saw them as kind of equipment for struggle. Schomburg described his library as powder with which to fight our enemies, and he described the books on his shelves as the sleep of the just, right? So he sees the Black library as a site of anticipated justice, and he does that in part through the work of revaluation. Okay. Now, scene 2 kind of keeps us in New York, but in another part of Harlem. And it takes us to another archival scene. And this was a site that was known not just for its books, its rare books, like the ones that Schomburg acquired at auction, but for what its collector, Alexander Gumby, called a vandal history that was made of disappearing things or ephemera. So Alexander Gumby wrote, kind of paraphrasing a 19th century manual on scrapbook. He said, how many things people trample under their feet that should be put in their heads, right? So he was very interested in the kinds of things that might be trampled or trashed, ephemera, ticket stubs, newsprint, calling cards, and he saw those as valuable for what he called a history of the Negro in scrapbooks. So Gumby was a kind of flaneur in the Harlem Renaissance. He was kind of known for his dressing as a dandy, kind of wearing fancy clothes and his pale yellow kid gloves. And he moved between uptown and downtown, right? He was kind of a member of the Greenwich Village's not so underground gay scene, as well as a character in the Harlem Renaissance. And he was a prolific scrapbook maker who was collecting all of this ephemera of daily life and placing all of it in these exquisitely handcrafted scrapbooks that were made of brown paper. They're big, they're about 11 by 15 inches in size. And his friends called him Mr. Scrapbook. So he was collecting the ephemera, both of very famous figures, right here we have Frederick Douglass, as well as kind of lesser known and everyday figures. So one person said he collected every famous Negro and many not so famous. Now, Gumby had grown up in a world that was kind of flooded by texts and images that was made possible by cheap printing technology and paper. And this kind of ephemera encompassed everything from broadsides to pages of the penny press. And ephemera, paradoxically, although it was meant to be thrown away, it also, because it was so ubiquitous, it encouraged people to reuse it, right? And one type of reuse was about capturing the documentary value of clippings, in particular newspaper clippings, which could record fleeting events that might not be recorded in bound books, right? So these events might disappear, right, if not for the ephemera that captured them. Now, for African-American readers in particular, scrapbooks offered political possibility because in a moment when the print culture is so racist, right, and derogatory toward Black culture, scrapbookers could take the newspaper apart and then reassemble it in ways that valued Black life and history, right? Now, Gumby very carefully did this work in these exquisitely made scrapbooks, and he would kind of trim them with additional details to bestow glamour on them. So there's one page, for example, where he has a silk playbill from the Ziegfeld Follies, and he tucks it into a pocket in the scrapbook and labels it like this. So it says a silk playbill of the Ziegfeld Follies Frolic Ball of 1918. And then he has this note, he says, please handle with the greatest of care. Thank you. Gumby. And that is a note that invites readers to remove and unfold the silk, and by exercising care, to revel in Black history's fineness. So this too is a project about value, right? But Gumby is collecting a different kind of material than Schomburg. And so he's capturing a different frequency of Black history than the rare books that Schomburg coveted. The tilt of Gumby's collection was contemporary. It was about history in the making. So the New York News described Gumby's collection and said, not only does Mr. Gumby seek the great things that have been done, but also the seeds of things that will be great in the future. Now, to do this work, Gumby turned scrapbook making into an exuberant collective sport. He held these weekly salons in his apartment and had people come in. And you can see, if you look closely, you see this gathering of people. Gumby is the one sitting with his back to the camera in the floral dressing gown. And in the very back of that photo, you can see these bookshelves. Those are the scrapbooks on the shelf. And so the scrapbooks became something that attracted visitors to his salon. And this was a kind of interracial, queer, mixed gender crowd of folks who would come to his salon and pore over the scrapbooks. And one of the things that's really interesting to me about these scrapbooks is that they recorded, he calls them the Negro History and Scrapbooks, and he has scrapbooks dedicated to all the major historical events and figures you might imagine, right? He has one dedicated to Frederick Douglass. He has one dedicated to the NAACP, but he's also capturing this kind of history in the making around him, including the history of all of these salon goers who are not the marquee names that you imagine when you think of as the Harlem Renaissance, right? So among the people who came to the salon were Nella Comey, who was a teacher and poet, the man they called Sweet Teddy Hernandez, who was a journalist, Leontha Wright, who was an actress from Georgia, Constance Grayson, who was a young playwright. Again, most of you will never have heard of these names, and I hadn't either when I started this research. These are minor characters of the Harlem Renaissance, but they became subjects of the scrapbooks. The journalist Aubrey Bowser wrote about Gumby that he has, quote, a full set of clippings about every famous Negro and many not so famous. If you visit Gumby's studio, you may be surprised when he pulls an enormous ledger-sized book from a shelf and informs you that it is devoted to you and your doings. And indeed, in a series of pages that Gumby called the Negro Intellectuals Rendezvous, Gumby recreated what might have been a typical evening with the Gumby group. So you see here a photograph on the left of Teddy Hernandez. On the right, a photo of Constance Grayson. They're kind of facing each other in those photos as if they're in conversation. In between them is a poem by the Jamaican Irish poet Ferdinand Levy, who went to Gumby's salons. And then around them, the autographs of other salon goers. And then there's that drawing of Hernandez on the left, the pencil sketch. And if you kind of open that up, because Gumby would build flaps and pockets into his scrapbooks, hidden behind there is a cache of letters. You can see how the papers come out from behind the sketch. And those are letters that the salon goers, and he called them the Gumby group, exchanged with each other. And what's really interesting about this page is that he's capturing a kind of scene of the Harlem Renaissance that has nothing to do with the kind of headline names that you might imagine. And he's documenting the kind of intimacies of that group. Now, if this were a traditional archive, those letters would all be kind of separated in files and folders labeled maybe for each individual correspondent, and you wouldn't necessarily get that sense of how the salon produced this archive and the way that all of these figures were connected to each other. So there's a way in which Gumby is reimagining what an archive could look like and how it's organized and experimenting with who belongs in what he called a Negro history and scrapbooks. And so it's a kind of irreverent project to include all these minor characters in the grandeur of the history that he's creating. So this is one of the ways that I think about order and disorder and the kind of intellectual experiments that are required to create new ways of imagining Black history. And then I'll wrap up with a third scene, which is from the third chapter of the book. And this is really about the principle of risk and risk-taking. And this final scene takes us to the tiny Gainsborough Library in Roanoke, Virginia. This building is still standing. And this was what was known as a quote unquote colored branch. It was the segregated branch library for African-American readers in Roanoke. And here the librarian, Virginia Lee, gathered a small special collection of works on Black history and by Black authors. But almost as soon as she became the branch librarian, which was in 1928, she started receiving warnings about what the library should not do. So, for example, when she would design small exhibits on Black achievements, city officials would tell her to slow the pace, right? Or in another version of the story, they told her not to put those books out. And by the 1940s, these kinds of warnings accumulated so that the collection faced the threat of destruction altogether. And there's a well-known anecdote in Roanoke, and in the book, I talk about the difficulties of trying to piece this story back together. But it's a moment at some point in the early 1940s when city officials, maybe city council members, but probably the city's library director, once more warned Lee against collecting and displaying Black history. But this time they went further and told her not just to slow down, but told her to remove the offending books from the library's shelves. And these were likely some of the books that they threatened. And moreover, city officials told her that she could lose her job if she didn't comply with the demand to dismantle the collection. And in the act that has made Virginia Lee a local legend in Roanoke, she responded by appearing to comply with the order without actually doing so. And she removed the so-called offending books to the library's basement, hid them there, and provided secret access to patrons. And so her successor, Carla Lewis, recalled that when a patron wanted something, she would go down and bring it up for them. So this story captures a moment when Virginia Lee strayed beyond the boundaries of proper professional comportment. She knew that to protect the collection entailed a risk, but she said later, if it was going to cost me my job, that's the way it would have to be. I wasn't going to stop. So to save the collection, she took it underground, which is seemingly at odds with the philosophy of public librarianship, which is all about visibility and access. But this move to obscure the books from view is a reminder that hidden collections sit at the center of any information landscape. And that can be true in the sense of what the historian Peter Gallison has said, that the world of classified data actually dwarfs the open world of information lodged in our libraries. But it's true in a more specific context as well, which is that Black communities, which have been so often the target of surveillance, have had to make their archives unreadable when necessary, enacting what the poet Kevin Young calls the hiding tradition in African-American life. So in the way that Lee briefly told the story later, and the way that kind of rumors still circulate locally, there's a lot about the story that we don't know. We don't know why exactly city officials at that particular moment were angry about the collection, or even how they learned about Lee's collecting practices or which materials they targeted. I've tried to piece that story back together in the book. But what I actually find most interesting about this story is the fact that Lee is celebrated for this story. Her portrait now hangs in the library. But the fact that the city targeted that collection, the fact that any part of her collection invited censorship, should catch our attention, because it was not a group of books that anyone outside of Roanoke would have considered subversive, right? And compared with larger or finer collections elsewhere, like Schomburg's, Lee's acquisitions were modest. Some people might have seen the materials she had gathered as utterly replaceable, right? These were books that maybe she could have bought again and replaced. So why did she risk her job to do it? But to Lee, these books, this small archive, was essential to defend. She said it was an effort I absolutely refused to deviate from. And her adamance and the small collection's struggle to exist really epitomized the urgency and the radicality of record keeping in Black life. So that when the Roanoke officials kind of attempted to control the circulation of Black books, right, or to censor them, Lee had to move underground, right? She had to kind of move into the space of fugitivity in order to do her work. So she turned the library's order into an act of subversion. Even though she's also very famous for keeping strict order in the library, right? People who grew up in Roanoke remember that when they would go to the library, she would make them wash their hands before they used the books. And so that can seem, those two stories of her can seem like they're at odds. On the one hand, she's this radical hiding the books from destruction. And on the other hand, she's this she's policing the kids and how they handle the books. But I think these are really two sides of the same coin. I think her radicality grew out of her propriety, that the same reverence toward books that caused her to reprimand children when they came into the library to wash their hands was the same reverence that made her so determined to save the books when they were threatened with destruction. Because in Roanoke, even a collection that was modest and really about kind of Black achievement and respectability struck white officials as dangerous, right? They were threatened by that project. And so unbeknownst to them, these patrons who were washing their hands upstairs might have been doing so in order to use a secret library that was downstairs. And I think that underscores the risks that Black bibliophiles had to take for their collections. And I think it also suggests a lot of lessons for today when we're in another moment when Black history is under threat. So I will stop there on that note.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. It was a wonderful presentation of the text. And I'll say also, I had such a wonderful time reading the book. I had two feelings which were kind of opposite, but I felt them in equal measure. On the one hand, I was learning so much on each of the pages of the book, but at the same time, there was this great feeling of nostalgia because I've spent time at some of these repositories and some of these libraries and archives. So I was both learning, but also it was both familiar and unfamiliar to me in a really interesting way. There's some really fascinating questions in the Q&A queue. So I think I'm just going to ask one question that builds off of where you ended, and then maybe we can go to some of the audience questions, which look really quite fantastic. I'd like to start again where you stopped. We're now, unfortunately, experiencing a new wave of conflicts about information and its dissemination, where books are being banned, curricula are being scrubbed in libraries and schools around the country. At the same time, we're having really complicated and important discussions about the role that social media is playing in the disbursement of information, misinformation, and disinformation. So I wonder what lessons we could draw from your book to help us navigate this new environment around debates and conflicts around information and its dissemination.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. The book unfortunately gets more timely every day in thinking about the work that a century ago these figures they were working at a moment when people dismissed or erased the very idea of Black history, and they were working against that pressure. And as I just said with Virginia Lee, often facing these kinds of threats of censorship. And so I think their work does offer us many lessons. For one, the lesson that this is an ongoing tradition, right? That doing Black history requires again and again these kinds of this willingness to defend the project of Black history. And so that's something we just have to continue in this moment. But I also think a lot about the ways that figures like Dorothy Porter, who is a curator at Howard and who I write about in the 4th chapter, she was always working along parallel tracks in a way that I think is important. She was working in DC, and she spent 40 years trying to kind of fix federal information systems to make them more attentive to Black history, right? She was working with the Library of Congress and others to make the systems more attentive to Black history, for example, and to make sure Black history was included, right, in those collections. But she never lost sight of the fact that federal recognition of Black life and history was always belated and was always going to be fragile. And so she also, at the same time, was very dedicated to this autonomous Black history movement tradition that was, started by Carter G. Woodson. We're in Black History Month, so I think it's important to think about that tradition. She was building a collection at Howard for Howard, creating a network of other librarians at HBCUs, creating tools for them to use and cooperate together. So she was both intervening, but she was also inventing and protecting that autonomous tradition. And I think that's something we have to do as well, because this is certainly a moment where so much progress in terms of federal support for Black history projects is in danger right now. And so we have to make sure that we're nurturing those other autonomous, movement-centric projects to preserve Black history. And I think that there's so many people right now, and I won't even name them all, who are continuing this tradition. So for several years, actually, the Schomburg Center, for example, has been, through social media, through the digital space, reaching out to students who are in states where Black history has been, the study of Black history has been prohibited by state legislatures, and saying, hey, you know what, we'll give you a library card. You can digitally access our materials. Here's a syllabus. Here's access to these materials. So actually using the digital space to circumvent some of those prohibitions, I think, is a kind of continuation of that tradition of a kind of radical commitment to access. Before you go to the next question, I wanted to follow up on something you said. I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about your experience working in the Schomburg collection, because I know that I talked a little bit about the way that it's a kind of collective space and what it has meant to different generations of scholars. And for those who haven't been there, I wonder if you could say something about what it means to be in that space.
Yeah, I just had a conversation with a PhD student just last week. She's planning to go to the Schomburg to do research, and so she was asking me about collections. She wanted to know about the stuff that's on the shelves and what she might find there. But I found myself in answering her questions, I kept responding to her to talk about the experience of what it means to be in the Schomburg, that when you're there, your favorite scholar or poet or writer or artist will walk into the room, and there's all of these kinds of connections that happen in the reading room. And she kept asking me about collections, and I think I kept asking her about what you call collectivities. And it wasn't until we got 10 or 15 minutes into the conversation that I was like, oh, wait a minute. I'm answering a question that you're not asking me. Let's talk about the collections. So there is that sense of going to the Schomburg is about sitting in the seat where other people sat, and also just having this wonderful experience of who comes in and out of those doors. It's really a fascinating experience to work there.
Yeah. But see, I think you actually were answering her question in a way, because I would argue that history of collectivity shapes the kinds of questions you can ask, right?
Yeah,
Of
I
a
think
particular
you're
set
right.
of materials. And that when you're in that space and you kind of feel that century plus long project of people who have been politically committed to doing the work of Black history, I think it opens up possibilities for your research.
Yeah.
And so I actually think that collectivity, right, shapes what you can draw from the collections.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think you're right.
I don't know if you saw in the chat, but there are several people who have commented about their experiences at the Schomburg. So it does, elicit a lot of strong emotions and enthusiasm. I want both of you to continue your conversations while also answering the questions. But in order to do so, I would love to just do a couple of quick announcements, just so the housekeeping is out of the way and we can really focus in and enjoy everything. What a wonderful, fantastic insight and overview into the book. So thank you, Laura. And just a reminder that there is a discount code, and that we will, if you're wanting to share this with others or review some of the resources or the recording later this afternoon, you'll receive an email with a link to that recording. So please feel free to share far and wide. I'd love to invite you also to see our current exhibit, More Than Gray, Reimagining Early America in Full Color. You can visit in person at the Clements Library Monday through Friday from noon to 4, or if you're a little further afield, please take a look at it online. As we mentioned earlier, the University of Michigan Office of Academic Multicultural Initiatives is hosting events throughout the month of February to celebrate Black History Month. And so again, if you're in the area, you can learn more by visiting their website and check out some of the other offerings available. And then next month, we will be celebrating Women's History Month and welcome author Kimberly Hamlin for a discussion about her book, Free Thinker, Sex, Suffrage, and the Extraordinary Life of Helen Hamilton Gardner. And so since you're signed up for the Bookworm, you'll receive an email reminder about next month, and then hopefully you'll join us again in person, but if not, you'll receive that email with a link to the recording afterwards. And of course, if you're interested in sponsoring an episode of the Bookworm, I'm always happy to hear from people about your experiences with the Bookworm and any support that you might like to offer. But we most are appreciative of the fact that you've joined our group to support all of this wonderful research and to spread the word about these wonderful authors who share their information with us. So with that, I'll let Jason see what sort of weaves in and continue the discussion.
Yeah, there's actually a question at the top of the queue that I had, so I share this interest. I'll read the question as written, and I don't know, maybe I'll add a little line or two at the end. While the narrative text in your book is beautifully written, the book's visual narrative through photographs and images is also compelling. Can you discuss your choice of images in the book and the approach you took in unfolding your archival history in visual form? I'll just add to that. I think it's a great question. I'll just add to that from the reader's perspective, it's very clear that you chose those images very intentionally. But what's also clear is that the subjects in the photo are very intentional about how they want to be represented. So this is a really interesting connection there. So I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, thanks so much for both parts of that question. And I think this also speaks to something that you and I were talking about earlier about the way that this is both a project. Black Archive Building is both an act of defiance, right? But it's also an act of, what I call invention and pleasure, but we could also talk about it in terms of joy or exuberance. And I think it's important to hold on to both of those. And I think the visuals reflect that, because part of the project of amassing this material and sharing it was people were awestruck by the scope and the size of these collections. Claude McKay described it in kind of wondrous terms. For example, he described it as strange magic, the effect of being in the presence of Schomburg's collection. And that was partly a visual effect, right? So it was a sense that if you walked into the space, right? So this was true in any of these spaces you walked in. It wasn't just shelves of books. You were in a kind of sensorium, right? So all of them engaged in the work of exhibition and had materials on the walls and had the materials accessible to people. So it was meant to be a visual project as well as a textual project. I think about the public library that Vivian Harsh was headed on the south side of Chicago, and she was they were celebrating some of the earliest, what was then called Negro History Weeks, right, that took place in the library. And she wanted people, when they came into the library, to experience that celebration, even if they weren't actually coming to read any of the books. So she made sure that the space was curated in a way that on the bulletin boards, you would find original manuscripts, right, written by Du Bois or Carter G. Woodson. And so that people would engage with Black history visually as well as textually. And so I think the images reflect that. They were doing part of their project of broadcasting the fact that Black history not only existed, but that it was incredibly rich and abundant through visual strategies. And I think their joy in that work is reflected in their own portraits. in their own portraits as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And there is a certain there's a romance to the hardwood of the shelves and of the desks, and also of the way that they're dressed. They're clearly dressed to dignify the space in a certain kind of way, which is really quite interesting in the photos. So I appreciate that. There's another question here. Again, I'll read it as written, but it's a specific question, but I think it has kind of general and broader significance. So perhaps you can build out from the question. I just received an email stating that the current president has fired the Archivist of the United States and has appointed a political ally to oversee the National Archives and Records Administration. What suggestions do you have to preserve vital records, books, archives, and the like?
Yeah, this is incredibly important question, and distressing. I think this has to I think the preservation work has to happen on so many levels, right? I mean, there are scores of what you might call citizen archivists out there who have been capturing federal data sets and sites before they may be erased, right? Or before they have been erased. So kind of an act of citizenship to preserve information on federal websites that may be endangered now, and some of that material has already been erased. So I think that's really incredible kind of citizen archivist work. I also think that, this is like so many federal systems right now, we can take them for granted when they're working. And so there's a way in which, very few people think about kind of who the Archivist of the United States is or what that work entails. But I think advocacy, right, making our representatives aware that this is something that we're concerned about is important, that we have to advocate for the work that the National Archives does. I mean, the tradition of modern archives is deeply attached to the idea of democracy, right? And this is the French tradition, right? That we've inherited, the idea that a functioning democracy requires transparency through public access to the records of government, right? That's really a cornerstone. So I think that has to be part of all the many conversations we're having in this moment about how to be politically engaged citizens, needs to include that commitment to record keeping. But I also think that tradition that Dorothy Porter embodied, right, of also remaining committed to autonomous work that is outside of the state is incredibly important right now. And we have to find ways to support all of the grassroots and community history work that's happening, because the more that disappears at the federal level, the more important it is that we are working at a community level to do preservation work.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. There's another question here that I will read it as written, but I'll preface it just by saying that there's an interesting part of collecting in which the choice to collect is also the choice not to collect. That the things that you decide to prioritize is also in some ways the things that you decide not to prioritize or not to collect. I was really fascinated in the text about Schomburg's real interest in textual histories and of the book, but there was all of this wonderful material being collected at the same time, recorded sounds and songs of African Americans in the South that maybe he wasn't quite as interested in. So there's a question here that touches on some of that. I'm wondering about class and less well-known people from late 19th and early 20th centuries. How much did these collectors and librarians include the ephemera of less well-known and ordinary people? You talked a little bit about this in the difference between, say, Gumby's collection and Schomburg's collection, but I wonder what you might say in response to this.
Right. I mean, every history, right, is shaped by the particular lens of the historian or the documentarian, and those lenses are very much about race and class and gender. Schomburg, for example, is really interesting case because he wrote very little about women, right? He was an ardent fan of Phyllis Wheatley, and so he did write about her, right? But aside from Wheatley, most of the heroes in his published writings are men. but he was actually collecting the work of Black women authors, right? It's just less visible in what he did. So there's a kind of a discrepancy between the collecting work he was doing, which really valued Black women authors as activists, and he appreciated their publication record, versus kind of what he elevated as important in his published work. So you see those politics play out across all of the collectors. Gumby certainly had. Gumby also, really kind of snuck queer history into his scrapbooks in ways that are there. It's not hidden. It's really there in all the scrapbooks, but he doesn't necessarily name it, right?
Yeah.
So none of the scrapbooks are named for any queer themes, but those themes are run throughout the scrapbooks. So you get this kind of irreverent depiction of gender and sexuality in his scrapbooks, which also attend to less famous, kind of more everyday folks. So I think those politics just run. Every collection has its politics. There's no one such thing as a Black archive, right? And that's precisely the work that all of these figures were doing. They were trying to answer that question, like, what is a Black archive? And they had disagreements about it. And those choices about, do you collect the diaspora or focus on the nation, right? Do you collect ephemera or rare books? All of those shape the kinds of records that we now have access to. And Schomburg, for example, wasn't particularly interested in music, but Dorothy Porter at Howard, and I know, we've talked a little bit about the important role of Black women in this story, who I think have always been appreciated as librarians, but I think the intellectual prowess of their work hasn't always been appreciated as such. Porter spent 40 years finding ways to kind of subvert various systems, and she had colleagues at Howard who just thought she kind of had no business having any ideas of her own. And so they would they would say what they wanted her to collect, and then she would find ways to do what she wanted. So for example, she would be told, just collect books, don't collect music. And she would collect music anyway, and then just list it as books in her reports, because she knew that people wouldn't recognize the titles. And so she would get away with it like that. But, I would shout out here too, for those who may not know about it, that the Detroit Public Library has the E. Azalea Hackley collection, which is a collection that was started by a Black musicians organization in the early 1940s. And it was the first special collection in the United States dedicated specifically to documenting the history of Black music. So some of the answer to that question is close to home.
No, I appreciate that. There's actually another question here that's more local than some of the others. So I'll just add it here because we're kind of on the topic. And it's on the topic of the Wright Museum's collection in Detroit. If you've had any interaction with that collection or know anything about papers that might be held at the Wright.
I don't know a lot about it because the founding of the Wright collection happens after the time that I talk about in the book. But what I'm interested in the book is the kind of prehistory of the Wright Museum and others like it, right? So there's and Mabel Wilson has a book. It's called Negro Building. It's a wonderful book, if you haven't read it, about the history of the Black Museum movement, and she talks about the Wright Museum and others. And that work really builds on the work of figures like Schomburg and Dorothy Porter, and the work that they did in the early 20th century to create the scaffolding for the study of Black history and for the preservation of these materials, is part of what allows the Black museums movement to take off in the later period in the 60s and beyond. So I don't know if I can really answer the question except to point you to Mabel Wilson's book if you haven't read it, because it's fantastic.
No, I really appreciate that. There's a question here towards the bottom that, again, I'll read the question as written, but I imagine there might be other paths that you can take this. In a way, it's a question that returns to the point that you made just a moment ago about what is a Black archive. So in your research, I'm sure you've come across the intersection of American Indians. Do you have any suggestions I can pursue? I'll just add to that. I imagine that there are all sorts of superfluous kinds of conversations and things that are happening in the archives that as you've studied them, that Indigenous people may come up, or a whole range of kind of other identities are kind of located within the space of this Black archive. So I'm just interested to see what you might say about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's entwined in so many ways. And I think, for example, about the Hampton Institute,
Yes,
which is
sure.
another institution where I did some of the research for this book, which in its early years was educating both African Americans and Native Americans. That was the two student groups that it was surveying. And so, you know, we think of Hampton as an HBCU and as one of these Black archives, but it's also part of Indigenous record keeping too. And I think, my colleagues who really study and are involved in questions of Native American archives encounter some of the same questions that I do in terms of the tensions between records of surveillance and power, right? And the records of social, political, and cultural movements. Because so much of the record of the written record, right? This is very different from oral traditions, right? But so much of the written record of Native American history is in state and federal archives, right? Which were not kept, right, with the idea of centering Native American voices, right? Those records were kept to cement the government's power, right, in those relationships. And so to write Native American history is always to function kind of in tension with those records, to need them, certainly, but how do you also how do you read them both along and against the grain, right, as historians would say? But they're also, this is true in so many movements, and it goes back to the point I made that every movement has its resident documentarians. There's also a very rich history of Native American archiving and community archiving that runs parallel to those histories of surveillance and bureaucratic record keeping. And so, any kind of researcher or historian has to navigate through that territory. And I think that's true in the field of Black history, and in Indigenous studies, and in queer history, right? Those are themes in all of these linked stories.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I'm noticing a theme in some of the questions that I'll call the theme the fragility of the Black archive. There are a few people have asked questions about, well, what about these books? Have they survived? Or what about these? Have they been recovered? I'll read just one as an example, but you might use it as an opportunity to talk more broadly about the fragility of the archives. And you write about how some of these archival collections had to be kept in moist basements before they could be recovered, or they were subject to surveillance, or they were under threat in a lot of ways. So you might just take this question up to ask or consider a larger question about the fragility of the archive. Did Douglas's collection of his own edited newspapers at his home in Rochester, which was burned up in a house fire, ever get replaced? So that's a specific question about one particular collection or archive, but I wonder what you might say either to that or just to the larger question of fragility of this work.
I really want someone to write the history of Douglas's various archives, because it's really interesting. And he had sets of materials in several different places. And because of his importance, there was always anxiety about the fragility of those materials, whether they were safe, how to preserve them. And I'm not sure exactly about the materials in Rochester, but I've studied a bit the worries about his material from his home in Anacostia in DC, right? Which, when he died, were still in the house, and the status of the house was unclear, and it was unclear kind of what would happen with the papers. And so there's a really interesting letter from 1926 when Schomburg sold his collection to the New York Public Library, and the sale had got national headlines. It was kind of a blockbuster acquisition. And so there's the correspondence from people writing to Schomburg about that. And one of them is from Anna Julia Cooper, who was a kind of proto-feminist, Black proto-feminist, scholar of the early 20th century. And she writes to Schomburg to congratulate him on the acquisition of his collection, but really to talk about Douglas's archive in DC and to say that she's worried about the collection and that she hopes the same thing that happened to Schomburg's collection will happen with Douglas's collection, that she says something like that a reputable library, right, will preserve it. And there's just running debates and worries about Douglas's materials, and the WPA tries to catalog them and preserve them. And I'm not sure what happens to all the pieces of his collections, but it does speak to the fact that there's this, and it gets back to your question about collectivity. These are not just sole pursuits of eccentric bibliophiles, right? These are community collective concerns, right? There's a sense, there's a collective sense that the preservation of Black history is often fragile and under threat. And so it becomes a community imperative to undertake the work of preservation. And I think that's what you see in all the anxieties about what's going to happen with Douglas's archive, is that sense that this is a collective concern.
Yeah. That's great. There's a really interesting question here that draws the distinction between books and authorship that is interesting. The portrait that you draw of Schomburg is a fascinating portrait, but it's also it's humorous at times, like the way that he interacted with books and the conversations and slight competitions that he had with friends about collecting books. There are moments in there where you're kind of rooting for him and kind of laughing at his own relationship. And there's a real sense that he has a very strong relationship to the collection. And so there's a question here that kind of follows on that. Did Schomburg or any of the other collectors of the period focus on books as physical artifacts that were created by Black artisans in addition to their interest in Black authorship? Was there any interest in books as books and how they were formed, and in particular, maybe Black craftsmanship around that?
That's a really interesting question. And I don't know how carefully Schomburg tracked, for example, printers and publishers. He certainly would have been aware, right, of he would have been aware, for example, of which publishers and printers were most likely to print abolitionist texts or to print Black authored works. But he never really foregrounds that. He doesn't write about the artisans of the book, right? The people who were the binders, the printers, the publishers. He doesn't really write about them, and it's not really how he organizes his information. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think he appreciated the craft of the book, and so he often will talk about the physicality of the book. And when he was involved in producing books himself, he talked a lot about the quality of the paper and the binding. So, for example, he collaborates with a German bibliophile named Charles Hartmann to publish small kind of pamphlet edition of Phyllis Wheatley's work. And he talks about it being bound in Japanese vellum and the fineness of it and the fact that it's expensive, because for him, the materials of the book were part of that project of bestowing value. So I know he thought about it, but he wasn't really keeping track of his collection in those terms. I think Dorothy Porter at Howard was more of a bibliographer. And I mean that in the sense of a bibliographer as someone who's paying attention to those questions about the printing history of a book, right? One edition versus another edition of the same title, where it was published, who published it. She was paying more attention to that work. And so she is someone who I think is part of that tradition. But I think in part that's work that's happening now, right? At the American Antiquarian Society, right? There's work to track the identity of Black printers, and the Black Bibliography Project. Jackie Goldsby and Meredith McGill's project is working on that. And I think they're very directly building on the work of Dorothy Porter, and they credit her legacy. I think she made that kind of work possible, but I think it's something that's really happening today as an extension of that work.
I actually have a question that follows on that one, which is, I hate to say that I might be revealing myself. Angela,
Go ahead.
how are we doing on
Yeah,
time?
no, please go ahead. And then,
Okay,
and then we'll. start to
This
wrap
may
up.
be the last one. I hate to, I hope it's not anticlimactic now that I've built it up. But I'm revealing myself a little bit. But I'll say that I came of age at a time when you went to physical libraries, you studied in the physical library, the books were on the shelves. And at that time, and really, if I'm being perfectly honest, only recently did I come to question this. I had long understood the systems of ordering or indexing that categorize books on the shelves as neutral. But you offer a fascinating reading of the Dewey Decimal System and the myriad ways that it enforces and obscures powerful ideas about race and racial hierarchies, and that Black women were at the heart of kind of exploding and expanding much of what we know and how we even walk through the libraries when we do walk through them. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that. It was a fascinating passage, and I was all over the 326s and making all of the notes about the Dewey Decimal System in that passage. My copy of the book is really marked up in the margins in that section. I just wondered if you wanted to say anything more about that.
Sure, I'll say something, quickly about that, because I think it gets back to this point about gender and about the fact that the work of Black women librarians, I mean, they were appreciated. Langston Hughes loved librarians. He would shout them out, but he would describe them as, those wonderful ladies who help you find books, right? There's a kind of gender dismissiveness where he's like, oh, we love them, but they're just getting things off the shelf for you. And so there's a kind of obscuring of the intellectual power of the work that they were doing. And that has to do in part with the very technocratic work of redoing information systems. Dorothy Porter was always getting letters from people from around the country who couldn't find the information about Black history that they were looking for. And it wasn't because the material wasn't there in their local libraries. It was because of how it was cataloged and described that it wasn't findable. So her project was as much about intellectual access to Black history as it was about physical access. So in Virginia, Virginia Lee was having to wage battles about physical access to Black history. Porter knew that you could hide a book intellectually as well as physically, right? That if you just put everything about Black history under the category for slavery or the quote unquote Negro question, which is how most libraries did it in the 1920s, it would be impossible for a researcher to really find what they were looking for or to understand how rich that history was. So she, took some risks in her profession to take the Dewey Decimal Classification and break apart those categories and move things around so that the full scope of Black knowledge and history became visible, right, to researchers and to make it usable, right? And she often kind of played down that work in some ways, but it was incredibly powerful. It's the scaffolding, right, for the very field of Black studies, right? Part of Black studies is about creating a field in which so many different kinds of questions can be asked and pursued. You can't do that work if the very field rests on such kind of narrow pillars, right? So part of what Porter and others were doing was literally creating the scaffolding for the inquiry of an entire field, and it's gone unrecognized until recently. So I'm glad that work is getting its due.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate that.
I just have to say, along those lines, I've noticed that there's lots of librarians who have tuned in today, and that we see you and we value you very much. And I just had a conversation with a donor who said, what is, the thing that you really need money for the most? And I said, cataloging, because in the tiny, tiny chance that we ever got caught up and or didn't have things coming in, there are so many collections that need more modern keywords and ways to make them searchable and visible to a myriad of scholars who are looking at topics that perhaps are obscured by an old system. So yeah, it's an amazing and often unrecognized profession.
Yes, amen to that.
All right. Well, this has been amazing. And thank you so much for this amazing discussion, and for writing this book, and for the work that you both do in such interesting topics. And thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a fantastic weekend.
Thanks so much. That was great.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye.